Where are we today, Phil?
St Leonard's Church, Sheep's Tor. And we're here today to talk about a man called John SYMS. Now, John SYMS matriculated from Oxford University, aged 16 in 1615. In 1623, he was ordained vicar. Now, he came here in the early 30s, made lots of friends. He was brilliant in the community. He was very active in this area and around Photiou, Beckley, Tavistock. He was much involved. He had friends over at Longstone, which is across the valley, Photiou, a house on the other side of the valley. He would communicate, he would have dinner there, he got on with the family. And another friend was Elizabeth Drake, who was the widow of Thomas Drake, Sir Francis Drake's younger brother. Now, although he was active in the community, when the Civil War came, he became very puritanical in his ways. He joined the Puritans. That's when things started to go wrong for him. Although he's kept his friends, he was very outspoken. Now, John SYMS kept a daybook that's an invaluable source for historians of the Civil War, especially in this area and Plymouth. And his earliest recordings of the Civil War were in late 1642. Let John SYMS tell you himself.
The 29th of November 1642, the first siege began at Plymouth. The enemy under Sir Ralph Hopton beleaguering the town round about 3 weeks apace, there not being many of them. I hear that royalist soldiers are looting houses in Tavistock, a mere 7 miles from here. It makes my blood run cold. The heathens! The royalist forces are taking over Devon. I despair.
The sound of sheep's door would have been just the same back in the day. A bird sings. The country as it war.
By the late summer, early autumn of 1643, most of Devon had fallen to royalist forces. Barnstaple, Bideford, Appledore, Exeter, Dartmouth, Totnes were all under royalist control. After an illness, Prince Maurice decided to move west to take the last stronghold under Parliament's control, Plymouth. Now, when his troops arrived, sort of later in the autumn, the local constables in the countryside were ordered to gather food, money, anything, livestock, and send it to the soldiers besieging Plymouth. There were 9,000 to 10,000 royalists around Plymouth, needed feeding. The only way to get that food, local people, local farms. No matter what your beliefs, if you were a parliamentarian, you must send food. Now, John SYMS was against this. His own wife, Elizabeth, was ordered to send food, a small amount, to the soldiers. He told her not to do it. He told his friends not to do it. He was so loud in his objections to this that people heard about it. Local soldiers, local royalists on duty in Tavistock, in small villages, heard about him in taverns and threatened to kill him if they ever caught him. Now, John SYMS was ordered to make proclamations, royalist proclamations, declare them in his church. He refused. The constable said, if you refuse, you'll be arrested and imprisoned. John SYMS refused. And they said, right, we're going to come out and watch you. And on the appointed hour of his sermon, he refused to do these proclamations, and he got over it by doing the sermons early in the day. So by the time the royalist commissioners got there, the service was over. They were infuriated. John SYMS was forced to go into hiding. He stayed with his friends, the Elford family, Walter Elford, over at Longstone, the other side of the Burrator village, opposite from Sheepstor. He hid in his own church. He hid with friends. At one stage, he was forced to run through the countryside with only his stockings and his clothes, no shoes. And this country is tough. You got stones, you got gorse. In the end, when Prince Maurice abandoned his siege of Plymouth in December 1643 and moved away, John SYMS saw the only recourse for him was to go to Plymouth. Otherwise, he knew he would be arrested, so he decided to go to Plymouth in the winter. John SYMS has had enough. He was being threatened by friends, the constables and soldiers who were in the area with death, imprisonment and fines. So he decided, I can't stay here any longer in Sheepstor. I'll have to move to the only safe place in the area, Plymouth, 10 miles away across the moor. So on a dark night, February the 4th at 8 a.m, he packed up a few belongings, left his wife and marched across the moors to Plymouth. He had to travel through gorse, gullies, furze, high hedges, but he slowly made his way to Rowborough, following a lane he knew quite well.
I was fell upon by royalist sentinel, and they bid me stand, whereupon I ran back again, and spying in the twilight a little open place in the hedge, not passing 2 foot broad, which God in his mercy had provided for me, the rest of the hedge being high and thorny, I took the opportunity and got thither. There's a break in the high furze, and I rested myself a great while, and got away.
After his close encounter with a royalist outpost near Rowborough, John SYMS made his way into Plymouth, and he came across Drake's Leat, Drake's waterway that supplied Plymouth with fresh water. And he followed that leat, because he knew it went into Plymouth, all the way to Knacker's Knoll, now Crown Hill. There was a royalist outpost, so he carefully avoided the royalist position and carried on into Plymouth. He moved down into the town via Magdalen Fort, the keystone work at the top of North Hill, and arrived at the town at 8 a.m. next morning, February the 5th, after a harrowing night.
Ever since I came in, the Lord followed me with his mercy and raised up friends for my maintenance. Blessed be the name of the Lord.
John SYMS would remain in Plymouth till the end of the war, a year and a half. In that time, he would have to go out and administer to the troops. He didn't have a church of his own. There were already plenty of refugees in Plymouth. All the other churches in Devon, a lot of people have fled to Plymouth. John SYMS was served the garrison as a kind of chaplain. He would go out to the various forts and trenches and minister to the soldiers. And there were ships in the harbour, so he would go on board ship and minister to the sailors. In the summer of 1644, after he'd been here a few months, the Earl of Essex marched into Cornwall with an army to free Cornwall of the king's influence, if you like. While he was marching into Cornwall, a Roundhead army under the Earl of Essex left London and left Oxford and marched after him. And Essex found his army trapped in Cornwall near Photiou after several battles around Lostwithiel. Now, with adverse winds, you couldn't get ships from Plymouth with supplies in or take the men off because the ships were coming down and get blown back. John SYMS served on one of these ships, the Providence, and wrote in his diary that how he tried to come down to Photiou and relieve the army but failed and came back to Plymouth. He also recorded that the Earl of Essex abandoned his army, with the king's army pushing him further down to Photiou, into the narrow area of Photiou, right by the sea, with the sea at his back. His 9,000-man army was in the dire straits. So Essex abandoned his army and took a boat back to Plymouth with some of his commanders, leaving General Philip Skippon, to surrender the army of 9,000 men, one of the biggest surrenders in the Civil War, to the king. Now, Essex arrived back in Plymouth and went around blustering and shouting at people what to do, to hold Saltash, fortify, bring more cannons up. When the king marched to Plymouth, with his victorious army, before he arrived, the Earl of Essex bravely abandoned Plymouth and went off to Portsmouth. So the king came north of Plymouth, second week of September, and besieged the town. There was skirmishing. They tried to make this town surrender. They offered surrender. The garrison refused. We were outnumbered 3 or 4 to 1. But we defied the king. For 10 days the king stayed in here, and in the end he left. And this is what was recorded by John SYMS in his diary. So,
and the enemy, the king being with them, came against Plymouth, fell on very desperately, having got Mr. Symmons's orchard at Thornhill, and Mr. Rose with some heifers thereabout. But 30 of our dragoons, lying in a corner on the side of the orchard and hedge, so galled them, the enemy ran away from them.
the king abandoned his siege at the end of September and moved away from Plymouth. And shortly after that time, John SYMS, the puritanical vicar, had a dispute with Captain John Ellison, who was in charge of the Providence, when SYMS went to Cornwall to try and relieve the Earl of Essex's army. Now, John SYMS fell out with Ellison big time, all over swearing, because the Puritan way of life, you weren't supposed to swear, but soldiers swear. And a lot of officers were agitated. Lack of pay and conditions in Plymouth were not the best. So a lot of these soldiers were in the pubs, gambling, swearing, not getting on with people. When the governor of Plymouth, Lord John Robarts, heard about this, people reported to him. These men were arrested. Some were sent to London to explain why they were breaking the Sabbath, why they were swearing, why they were not obeying the Puritan way of life. And one of those who complained about them was John SYMS. Now, he got a petition up, and a lot of the crew of the Providence backed him up. They backed up John SYMS, even against their own captain. John Ellison was not happy with this. So SYMS sent his petition to the Admiralty in London under the Earl of Warwick, who was in charge. He went to London to defend his petition. Ellison went to London to explain to the board what was going on. SYMS expected Ellison to be reprimanded, but being Navy men, they came out, the commissioners of the Navy came out on Ellison's side against SYMS. Fortunately for SYMS, because he lost, he was lucky not to be imprisoned. So he was not in the best of moods, and he returned to Plymouth in the new year, 1645 now, January, in time to learn that there was a royalist army camped north of Plymouth, another royalist army of 10,000 men under Sir Richard Grenville, the treacherous Sir Richard Grenville, who was earlier offered command of Plymouth if he sided with Parliament, but he went with the king. Now, one of the most memorable incidents of this siege was a few battles north of Plymouth, but Fort Stamford, across the water there, where the Royalists occupied the earthworks in about the 16th of February 1645. A regiment was sent over there, Colonel Mahoon's regiment, about several hundred men, 200 to 300. They were told to rebuild the old earthwork that was there in the early days and was broken down by the Royalists. They reoccupied it. No cannons, there were no cannons there yet. It was all infantry with muskets, barrels of powder, boards to reinforce the walls when they were built. When the High Command in Plymouth heard this, they sent soldiers over by boat to over the Catwater. They landed, the cavalry went up, the cavalry were forced back, then the infantry were sent up, and there was a small, quick battle, and I'm going to let John SYMS tell you about that one.
The enemy stood it very stoutly a while, and fired fast on our men, who, notwithstanding, went on undauntedly with their colours, and entered the enemy works.
After a brief show of resistance, the Royalists broke and fled, leaving 100 dismayed prisoners behind, arms, powder, boards. These men were brought back to Plymouth. John SYMS lorded a great victory for us over the Royalists over there at Fort Stamford, and he listed over 100 prisoners by name, including officers. But he also underestimated the losses. He said the parliamentarians lost 1 man killed and 2 men wounded. But if you look at the burial records of St Andrew's Church, more than 10 soldiers were buried the days following the battle. So that pushes the losses up to more than a dozen wounded and perhaps half a dozen to 10 men killed. Shortly after the fall of Fort Stamford, Sir Richard Grenville and his army north of Plymouth were ordered to abandon the siege and march east to take on the new model army that was marching into the West Country. Shortly after that, John SYMS was down on the Barbican and he ran into an old friend of his nemesis, Captain John Ellison, who he tried to take to court in London and failed. I'll let John SYMS tell you what happened next.
He ran after me in the street and beat me and called me a knave and a rogue.
He was forced to run for his life, and he complained, in his diary he complained that nobody would stop and help him. He was yelling to people to help him, but nobody helped him. He managed to get away with a few bruises and lumps on his head, but it just shows the feeling, although they were Puritan in Plymouth, there were a lot of people that weren't Puritan. Shortly after the Royalists left Plymouth, John SYMS' wife Elizabeth and their children came into Plymouth to join him and stayed with him throughout the rest of the period. John SYMS went on to describe events that were going on. There were still skirmishing around Plymouth. There were still raids going on up country as far as Dartmouth, Salcombe, out on the moors. There was always Royalist cavalry units around the area, a blockade on the other side of the Plym. John SYMS describes a lot of these in his book, and at the end of the war he finally tells us how the Royalists abandoned their final positions around Plymouth.
It pleased God to bring a rumour and a fear upon the enemy, that he in great haste forsook and quitted all their works and their strongholds in Plymstock, Plympton, Plymbridge, Newbridge and Hopton's work, for which with all this and other victories we had a day of thanksgiving on January the 14th.
After the war, John SYMS moved with his family to Deans Prior, where he became vicar. After a few years, he moved from there to Buckland and took over there. But at the restoration of Charles II, he lost his office. anyone who opposed Charles I lost their offices. So he was out of work. Within a few years, he was brought back and given he was given a church in Ashburton, allowed to preach in Ashburton. Shortly after that, he moved to West Ogwell, where in 1676 he died. That was the end of John SYMS, the outspoken Puritan minister of Plymouth, who recorded a diary without which we would never know as much as we do about the English Civil War at the first siege of Plymouth.